We all know that the life of a fiction author can be a solitary one, and sometimes solitude is necessary for creativity, but sometimes that solitude can weigh on you. So there's a difference between being alone and being happy about it and being creative and being lonely. So this is a fine line that we're going to be discussing in this episode of the How to Be an Author podcast that's all about the idea of going solo. I'm going to be talking about 3 of my writing coaching clients that I've spoken to about this theme of solitude. The first one is worried about how many characters she needs to have in her book. She realized that her characters were falling flat, and the diagnosis was novel. So we're going to be talking about how many characters you really need, how many characters probably aren't necessary, and also why there is an advantage to sometimes having your main character be a little bit solitary for at least part of your story. Second writing coaching client that I'm going to be helping out was actually struggling with the whole idea of the solitude and the loneliness that comes with writing. And we tried to build kind of some mindset hacks and ways to solve for this loneliness that could be inherent in being a writer, but doesn't need to be. There's a whole thing of reframing this, but also finding outlets that are both social and creative in nature so that you find a balance in your life when it comes to being alone versus not. The third author we talked to and the third author that I helped is one who had decided to go the self-publishing route and was starting to freak out about going it alone and being solo and not having any help when it came to publishing their book. This is somebody who had expected to go conventional publishing at first. It didn't work out that way, and now they're thinking they're alone, but that couldn't be further from the truth. And I let them see what kind of ways they had to feel supported in the whole self-publishing journey so that they don't feel like they are alone in the world. So welcome to this week's episode of the How to Be an Author podcast. We're talking about the theme of solitude versus not in an author's work, in an author's mindset, and in an author's business.
If you're a writer dreaming of becoming a successful author, join me, writing coach Corinna Akavane, on the How to Be an Author podcast, your weekly source for writing information, inspiration, and motivation.
Hello, I'm writing coach Corinna Akavane. It is my passion in life to help writers like you go from idea to published and promotion and everything in between. I not only lean into the ideas of writing craft, but also writing mindset and writing business. That's why each episode of the How to Be an Author podcast has those 3 general pillars so that you can see that being an author is a whole package. It's not just the writing craft, it's not just the mindset, and it's not just the business end of things, though some authors sometimes will leave one of these things by the wayside. So let's start talking about this idea of solitude, going it alone as a writer. My first client that I'm going to be talking about today is Anna. She was working on her book. This is her first novel. And she was noticing that many of her characters felt like they were falling flat. And some of her beta readers came back to her and said, I'm having a really hard time differentiating between characters, and I'm having a hard time really getting super in with the main character and really feeling that they're sympathetic and that I'm attached to them and that I care what happens. Upon doing a editorial assessment on Anna's work, which is one of the services that I'm providing right now. FYI, if you're curious about that, go to creativeandwritingcoach.com, look at this, and you're going to be seeing my editorial assessment. I can only take a couple a month, but if you want to apply, it is definitely something that's going to let you see some of the problems that might be in your novel right now so that you can fix them at an early stage. So Anna comes to me and I noticed that the big problem is she's got too many characters. Now, I told her not to beat herself up over this because it is very common for writers, especially newer writers, to have a lot of characters. Why does this happen? Why do we put too many characters in our book? One of my funny theories is that writers are lonely and they're writing by themselves, so they're writing themselves some friends. And they want their character to be really well surrounded by a bunch of confidants and friends that maybe they're not feeling like they have in their life right now, so they write them in. And I agree, this is so fun to do. Newer writers get really excited in all the world building. And this is something that characters are part of world building, creating all the characters that inhabit a world. Of course, they want to know all the details about the guy who's the barista in the coffee shop that the character goes to, and then the girl who's in their yoga class, and then the person who they meet when they walk their dog, and they're giving each of these characters names, characteristics, details, because that's world building and that's fun. But you've got to stop at some point and realize, is the dog walker crucial in the story, or can I just say she walked by the cute dog walker and leave it at that? So that's a really important thing to know, that you don't need to kill off all your characters, but you do need to think about who gets completely developed and who gets a name, who gets a character arc, etc., etc. But let's keep talking first about why some newer writers tend to write in way too many characters. A lot of writers seem to think that their plot is a little bit too simplistic. And if you're curious, listen to one of my previous episodes about keeping it simple, because many writers are thinking, oh, my plot's not complex enough, my world is not deep enough, and adding more characters is going to add depth and complexity. I don't always think it works out the way you think it might. So this is something that I would warn against. I think that I see where you're coming from, but it's not always the best idea. Another thing, many of you grew up on these huge series or these big dramas or these Game of Thrones style stuff where there's a huge cast of characters that you get introduced to little by little. And yes, every single time I tell people, okay, you need to restrict this or reduce that, they'll say, oh, what about George R.R. Martin? Yes, I know there's always the exception that proves the rule, but let me tell you that as a writer starting out, you're not writing Game of Thrones yet. I know that you're influenced by these large casts of characters in the series that you're watching or reading, but right now, I want you to create something that's more self-contained, because if not, it can be creating problems. Now, some writers can absolutely handle all of this and they're like, I'm writing a different kind of book. Fair enough. But know that you might alienate some of your readers. Maybe you'll find other readers who are like, oh, I love having to keep track of 50 characters. But some other readers are like, I'm absolutely lost. Another issue is subplots. Many authors love writing a B story or a subplot or several subplots. And then they make the mistake of thinking, oh, if there's a subplot, I need to have all new characters for that subplot. That's not necessarily true either. You can have a subplot that involves some of the same characters that we've already met. So keep in mind that a subplot doesn't necessarily mean a whole new cast, because your subplot really does need to be related to your book in some way, right? To the main story. There are different ways of doing this, and there are subplots that are more or less closely related to the main action of the story, but somehow it all needs to work in the end. Many newer authors also love to tell stories about their personal experiences, so they're going to throw in some characters that are similar to characters that they have met in their life that they really wanted to include in their story. Now, this is really charming, of course, but this is something that really should be edited out. And many newer writers tend to not want to kill their darlings. Once they've written something, editing is really scary for them. They're like, I don't want to cut this out. I worked on it so hard. I really love this character. And so I see how there's a reluctance to go back and simplify. But you've got to know this. When you are editing and simplifying, you aren't stealing from your reader. You're actually streamlining the story and you're giving them more depth to sink their teeth into. So never throw away anything. Keep those characters that you killed off in a folder. But I think it's really important to realize that sometimes you need to start paring back some of your characters. Why is it such a problem to have too many characters? Number one, I hinted at it, the depth. If you have a ton of characters that you're having to describe and go into that we need to know, your book only has so many pages. And again, you're going to tell me, oh, but so-and-so book has 1,000 pages. That's great. But the average book that gets published and that gets read is a certain number of words. And so you only have a certain number of words to devote to character development for each character. So the more characters, the less in-depth character development for the characters that actually matter. Next, you have confusion. Your reader is going to be reading about all these characters and they're thinking, is this one really important? Do I really need to keep track of this detail? Because when your reader's reading something, they're like, okay, do I need to keep track of the name of this character? Do I need to keep track of the fact that their eyes are blue and that that character's eyes are green? Because the writer wrote that, so is this important in the story? Like, we've been taught as readers that these details must be significant for some reason, right? Unless there's some genres where you're going to have different details or more or less characters. But usually the reader expectation is that each thing that's said to us about a character matters for the story. So this can really lead to some massive confusion when it comes to what is going on and to whom. Having all these different characters running around and having them interacting, other than leading to confusion, it can also dilute your plot and have your plot running around in a million different directions. Now, I have found that the most successful books have plots that go along like a freight train. It's something that's got a powerful motivator, that's an engine, and it's going along on a track, inexorably going towards the climax and the ending. When you have too many characters taking the story in a million different directions, this doesn't happen as successfully. Again, you're going to tell me there are exceptions. Of course there are exceptions. And believe me, you're writing your own book. You can do whatever you want. But when I have a writer come to me as a writing coach, it's often because something wasn't working for them. My technique is often to help them pare it back down so that they get a handle on what they're doing. And then I say, once you have something that's a really solid foundation, then you can start adding on complexity and layers again. But in order to get your story to a place that works, start to simplify, not to complicate. Remember that for each character that you name and that you give some kind of importance to, they're going to need to fit into your story somehow. So they're going to have relationships with the other characters. They're going to have their own character arc, and they're going to have a role in the story. So this means that we have a lot of moving parts that we have to keep track of. And I think that this can definitely make your story either be super surface level and all over the place, or it makes it be really, really long. So just keep in mind that these are some of the limitations that we're dealing with. And before we talk about which characters you absolutely need and which characters you might not need so much, I'd like to make the point that it's great to isolate your main character for at least part of the story, if possible. First of all, when you isolate a main character, they don't have that immediate support. So any kind of decisions or actions that are being made, they are making them themselves without anybody holding their hand. This makes it that much more main character worthy. This means that they're really displaying that character growth and development that the reader is there for. So that's really, really crucial, because I've seen too many young writers writing a story where the character's best friend might as well be the main character, because they are holding so much of the weight and responsibility of what's supposed to happen. So there's a confusion as to who's my main character. First of all, isolate the main character, and now they are pretty much more responsible for actually their own actions, and they have time to reflect. Reflection helps you learn. When something happens to you, that time of reflection, realistically, is what really does help you grow. This also can help the pacing. You've got action, 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 and then we've got a little bit of calm time to see what this action actually yielded. That's really, really important as well. When a character is isolated and alone, maybe a little bit uncomfortable, maybe lonely, maybe sad, maybe feeling a little bit helpless, that really helps to get the reader emotionally invested. It makes them so much more vulnerable, and it also leads to a little bit of suspense of how are they going to get themselves out of this solitary position, because the thing is, as human beings, we crave connection. So when your character is robbed of that connection, at least temporarily, that is a strong motivator, and that's something that the audience wants to see them being able to get out of that isolation and towards the connection. That's a happy ending in and of itself. Often when your character has this main character energy, that very thing can be pretty isolating as well, right? You've got main character energy, you're a little bit different than everybody else. Also, maybe you're lying to yourself, you're closed off. There are all these things that can close off a character or isolate a character, whether it's truly or symbolically, and isolating them in a real sense just strengthens that symbolic difference that your character actually has. It sets them apart and it makes them more protagonist worthy. So now that I think I've made the point for a little bit of isolation for your main character, and I think I've maybe made the point for the fact that sometimes we have a few too many characters. Let's talk about the characters that I think are very useful for you to have in any novel. Number one is the protagonist, the main character, the one that's actually doing things. Make sure that they really are a main character. As I mentioned before, that they actually are the protagonist and that they don't have a best friend who is dragging them along. So make sure that you have them, that they're very strong, and that the reader gets very invested in what's going on with them. The next character that you might have, or that you should have, is an antagonist. So many of you have an antagonist that's an antagonistic force that comes maybe from nature or the government or the environment or something like that. But oftentimes it's very helpful to have a character that actually embodies those antagonistic forces. And it's important to have them be nuanced. And it's important for them to hold up a mirror to the main character. They have something where they are an echo of each other, or they're a bit similar to each other, or they could be like each other if something were slightly different. This antagonist is definitely a character that's pretty important to have, and it needs to be pretty clear that they are the antagonist. Of course, you can have this end up to be a surprise depending on the genre of your book, but remember that this is a character you might want to have. Next, you may have a love interest. You may have a foil. You may have a sidekick, a mentor, comic relief, a supporting cast of friends, families, teachers. A mentor character could be somebody that's very important in your book. But again, remember that any of these characters that you might have, whether they are a foil, a sidekick, a companion, a mentor, an antagonist, remember that they each must do a job if they are to remain in your story. You might be thinking to yourself, that's great. I've got all these characters and I think they're all really useful. Many of my clients, they're resistant when I say, I think you need to kill off some of your darlings. Some of your characters might not be so necessary. I usually have to put it out there, let them think about it, and let them see for themselves whether the character is necessary or not. So how can you tell if a character is actually not as necessary as you once thought? Number one, is your character a bit redundant? Does your main character have 3 best friends that are their sidekicks who give them some really great advice, who are there for them when they need them, and everything else? You see where I'm going here. 3 best friends? Try 1. Maybe they just need 1 best friend. You can combine all of the characteristics of these best friends, if the plot allows for it, into 1 or maybe 2 maximum. You could have a good cop, bad cop going on with the best friends. Now you're having a different role and the characters are no longer redundant. Get it? Also, when you reread your story, ask your beta readers, are any of my characters underdeveloped? Do you feel that there are any of my characters who aren't really pulling their weight, who aren't doing a job? That character could probably very easily be taken out. So one time I was telling one of my clients, hey, I think this character is underdeveloped. What in the world do they do that we really need them? And they're like, oh, that's easy. They tell the main character that she needs to watch out because there's something behind her. And I'm like, literally anybody could do that. Anybody else. The fact that you have this tenuous reason just because you liked this character, you gave them this one little job, people see right through that. They don't need that. So if your character has a very tenuous reason for being there and they're not that developed and that they'd be pretty easy to take out and that their job could be given to somebody else, make them redundant, fire them. I have a lovely client who had a huge cast of characters and it was literally overcrowding her scenes. Like in literally every scene, it felt like there were 20 characters standing around doing nothing just so that her main character could feel like she was surrounded and like she was supported. And so literally every scene in my editing, I'd be like, how many characters are standing around in a circle in this scene? And she finally started to see that maybe we can do something a little bit more cinematic where even if your character is a member of an army and there are people all around, we're going to reduce their inner circle so that we know there are people around, but we're only talking about 2, maybe 3 people, so that you don't overcrowd the scene. I often say that a dialogue is best conducted between 2 people. I think that that's true of a scene unless you're having some triangulation happening or something like that. But remember, say to yourself, if I were shooting this as a movie and I had this many people in the room, would it be effective or not? If a character is distracting from the main theme, the main story, and the main action, they need to go. And here's another thing. When you're like, no, I don't want to kill off this character. I love them. They're so cool. They're so cute. They're so awesome. And they're not the main character. That's where I feel like you have a little bit too much self-insertion maybe. You're too attached to this character because they remind you of somebody that you like or that you would like to have in your life. So you've got this personal reason for wanting them around, but that reason doesn't align with your story. That character needs to go. Sometimes the harder it is emotionally to get rid of a character, the more you actually need to do it. Don't be sentimental. Make sure to have only the characters you need. Remember to give your main character a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of space, and even a little bit of uncomfortable solitude. And I think that that will actually feed your plot more than overcrowding it. And so finally, Anna saw all of these details and all of these truths in her own manuscript, and she was able to write something that was that much more streamlined and so much more powerful. Now let's talk about author number 2, Simone. Simone came to me because she was really lonely. She was suffering from the isolation of writing. And as she told me in our first meeting, this was something she did to herself. Simone started off actually working for a magazine. And so she was used to all these editorial meetings. She was used to bouncing ideas off of people. She was used to deadlines, which were really stressful for her, but which had her interacting with all different kinds of people. And then all of a sudden she goes to fiction writing and she feels like she is alone in this world. And at first she really enjoyed it. She's, oh, I need the isolation for my ideas. I need to get plunged into my story. My creativity craves this. I can't use the distractions too much. I need to focus. So she really ended up locking herself away. Now, sometimes when you get a little bit addicted to a hobby or an occupation, or you become a little bit of a workaholic, this isolation starts to feed upon itself and you start turning things down that you shouldn't be. You start putting yourself isolated and taking yourself out of society more than you actually need to for your creativity, because I think that isolation is important for a writer once in a while, but not to the point where it becomes problematic and uncomfortable or where you start to hide away. I've also seen a lot of writers that actually isolate themselves when they are going through not just the writing, but the editing process and also the querying process. They feel that they're going to have such a letdown, and that idea of the rejection that might be coming their way is so scary that they preemptively isolate themselves so that they don't have to have this big public failure. And I totally understand why this happens, but know that people who support you are gonna make your life better when you go through the inevitable failures and the yucky parts that come with being a writer. So having people who are actually supportive is gonna be a lot less scary than having to face those things alone, uncomfortable as they might be. When I started my writing group in person, so many authors came jumping on, but a lot of them were actually really afraid to join the writing group because they felt that writing is a very competitive industry. And they're not wrong. But here's the thing, you getting close to somebody doesn't mean that it's going to be that much harder if they succeed and you don't. A lot of writers seem to feel very protective of their ideas and very competitive when it comes to who won a writing contest or who got an agent versus who didn't, or who sold more copies of their book. So this is something where you really need to realize, do I need to be this competitive, or can I actually just be supportive and be around people who support me? Think about when you're in a different industry. You don't go hiding away from every possible peer in the industry because of potential jealousy or potential competition. You know what? Make that competition a little bit healthy. Be happy for your friend when they succeed, but help it to motivate you to then try to work harder and to get higher up. So they say that a rising tide lifts all the boats. Start to foster this welcoming and inclusive community of writers that are going to support each other instead of staying in your little bubble of hiding. Many writers also have mental health challenges or things like ADHD. I know that I am incapable of concentrating if I'm in a room with a lot of people, if I'm in certain phases of my writing. Then there are times that I can go into a coffee shop and I can actually work. But if you have to be alone and in quiet to be working, that is totally fair enough. But recognize that you need a break from that once in a while as well. So with Simone, what we really said was that we were going to be striving for balance. And she's, how do we do that? So I gave her a few real world strategies for cutting down on the isolation that's inherent in the whole writer's life. First, you need to be able to tell when you're too isolated. How can you tell? Think back to your day, to your week. How much social interaction did you have? If your only social interaction was saying hi to the cashier at Trader Joe's, you might not be having enough social time. You might be too isolated as you go through your process of writing your book. And this is something that you might want to start to address. Also, when you're alone, it's important to listen to yourself. So listen to your emotions. Are you being fed by your isolation? Is it something that is working for you? Or is it something that's making you unhappy and uncomfortable and lonely? This is really important. You can be alone but not be lonely. And you can be not that isolated but feel lonely too. These are two different things. One sometimes causes the other, but very often it's all about the optics and it's all about your mindset and what you're doing with your solitude. So really listen to yourself and be like, if you're feeling uncomfortable, I think it's time to address it for sure. And that's why I was so happy when Simone came to me. Clearly her isolation wasn't working for her anymore. And she listened to herself enough to think, how can I break out of this? Reaching me was the first step. And now she's got all kinds of other things she can do to feel a lot less alone. We're going to be talking about those in just a minute, but let's talk about some of the other signs that you might be a little bit too isolated as opposed to good alone. If you're starting to make excuses and neglect events, responsibilities, opportunities to go out and do things, you might be tipping over into the unhealthy side of being alone. Sometimes once you've been alone for too much time, you start to have these social anxiety and things like that. Really watch your mindset and start to think to yourself, am I turning too many things down? Am I resisting putting myself out there? Because that starts to become a vicious cycle as you do that. Another thing is when you start having these repetitive thoughts, overthinking, over too much of it on yourself, nitpicking in your work. This happens because you have no outside points of view, and that is not optimal. You need somebody who's going to come to you and be, completely objective, which you can't be anymore once you're too deep in it and have nobody to bounce ideas off of. Speaking of bouncing ideas off of people, sometimes when you're alone, you start to feel writer's block or creative block because you don't have that inspiration that comes from chatting with other people or from being out in the world. So remember that sometimes you can get into your own head. Maybe you can write some really good emotional content, dig deep, but then sometimes at some point you hit a wall. So it's important to realize that that is definitely one of the symptoms of being too isolated. The main thing that being too alone does to you is it gives you a loss of perspective. So you stop being able to see what really is, and you start just reaching deep down into yourself. And you could be telling yourself absolute lies. When you don't know what's going on in the world, all of a sudden everything happening inside of you takes on this huge importance. And so you become a lot less resilient because you don't have that perspective. You're not seeing your story in the greater scheme of things. And that can be really, really harmful to you as a writer and as a person. So how can we feel less isolated as an author who still craves some isolation? Scheduled breaks are a great way to do this, right? Just be like, I'm gonna write for X amount of time, and then I'm gonna schedule something fun as a break. Now, it doesn't always have to be something relentlessly social, but going for a walk in the neighborhood and petting all the dogs, or going to coffee with a friend, or going to a yoga class where you're surrounded by people and the yoga instructor is talking to you. All of these things are ways of breaking the monotony and the isolation in a way that's pretty low pressure. Joining writing communities. I mentioned the writing group. That's a great thing to do, or going to writing events and then having critique partners or having an accountability partner. All of these things also help you to feel a lot less alone. And somebody within the writing community is going to be somebody who totally understands your unique problems and the things that happen to you as a writer. It's great to have somebody who understands what you're going through. I have so many writing clients who go and work in a coffee shop, in a library, in a co-working space. And all of those places really help you to feel connected to the world. Even if you don't necessarily engage with anyone other than your barista, you're still out and about, there's still a possibility that somebody's going to come to you and be like, hey, what are you writing? And strike up a conversation. Great things can happen. Oftentimes, when we schedule things too much, or we're stuck in the same place too much, or we have a schedule that's a little bit too rigid, there's no room for those wonderful little accidents and meetings and happenstance that can possibly open up a whole new world. So I would say give yourself a shake-up for your schedule. Go someplace new, do something new. And this is going to both help you to not feel so isolated, but also help to inspire you. There are definitely a bunch of online collaboration tools as well. I've seen a lot of these, and my client was asking me about those as well. And they work for some people, they don't work for others. For me, I want either a Zoom meeting. That for me, I feel that there's a lot of connection that happens, and that's why I see most of my clients on Zoom or even on the phone. But usually in terms of online chatting and collaboration, I really don't do well with just texting or commenting on social media. But there is one exception. When I'm putting up videos on a platform like TikTok or something like that, addressing the comments in almost real time, so either doing a live or responding to comments as they come, like the first hour after you post a video, that really makes me feel like I am building connections. It makes me feel like I'm not so alone in the world. So that's interesting, right? That making a video can help you to feel like you are connected to people, and people feel more connected to you when you are on video rather than just, actually even making a podcast helps me to feel connected, but not so much in real time. But I really encourage you to try doing the video thing. And this also helps your author platform in great ways. I think it's a great way of being not so alone in the world using a newer technology. Finally, my favorite way of scheduling in some social time that feeds my creativity and feels like something that's manageable is volunteering. I love to volunteer. This is something where you meet people from all walks of life, and you can volunteer for anything. You can volunteer for an art museum. You can volunteer for a historic home. You can volunteer in a garden. You can volunteer in a homeless shelter. And each of these different places is going to be feeding a different part of your soul and of your creativity, and is going to kind of fulfill a lot of those needs that you might have socially and in terms of getting out of the house and doing stuff. And it really gives back. So I think that karmically, that's a good thing to do. And it's great because you can have a schedule that is more or less involved depending on what you feel you can do that week, that month, that day, whatever it might be. So I really, really encourage you to volunteer. Many times it opens up whole new avenues that you didn't think were available for you before. But as I said before, it is crucial to be alone sometimes. As a writer, you do need that alone time to be productive. That just is something that needs to happen. So how do you make that more comfortable? I say celebrate what you have achieved. In every period of writing, every kind of stint of, maybe you were doing writing sprints, Pomodoro method. Maybe you were sitting there at your desk and you managed to get X number of words down. Maybe you sat in your car and you recorded something and transcribed it. Celebrate that achievement. Whenever you see the trade-off between the time that you spent alone working so hard, keeping your nose to the grindstone, and the result and like what happened and how much you got done, that correlation makes it feel better and better to be alone, because you know that it is not for nothing. It is actual productive time. Another thing that you can do is make everything very ritualized. So your favorite coffee, a great candle, a playlist, a comfy seat, a throw, your cat on your lap. All of these things can make it so much more comfortable, pleasant, and even inspirational to write. In the winter, I love writing by the fire. That is like my favorite little workspace, is writing by the fire on a cold day. That makes it feel so good. Sometimes I'll invite a friend over to come co-write with me. I lay down the ground rules. We're going to be really quiet. We're going to do 3 writing sprints, and then we can get up and we can chit chat for 5 minutes, because you need a break sometimes. But it feels really good to make your writing space much more comfortable and pretty and organized. That's definitely going to make your alone time so much better. Being mindful, nourishing your creativity, giving yourself the space and the time to really engage in that self-care that's going to help your creativity to come out and play. When you're rushing, you never really have time to do this. When you're finally sitting down alone, this is when you could actually almost meditate and engage with yourself creatively. And it's really, really rewarding. And I think then in turn, it makes your next period of semi-isolation as a writer that much more rewarding and comfortable. View your solitude as a form of freedom. You're lucky to have the freedom to be there in quiet, in peace, in solitude, working on the thing you're passionate about. So don't tell yourself, oh, poor me, here I am all alone. Instead, think, I'm so lucky that I'm able to devote this time and this space to my passion. And finally, if you're taking a break and you have nowhere else to go outside. Nature has a way of making you feel not alone, whether it's a bird, a butterfly, or anything else. When you go outside and you move your body, you're gonna feel so much better in general. I hope that helps. But I think that it's really fair to talk about your solitude with somebody. I think that's really important. And if you're having these very negative feelings and that they're not going away, definitely talk to a professional, not just a writing coach, but maybe go into some therapy. Talk to somebody who can maybe help you to see if there's anything else going on. Okay, final author that I'm talking about this week is Michael, who decided to go it alone, go do the self-publishing route. And